Our next panel today is called Men Making Change. So often at these events we focus on women, but what's the role that men play in all this? We do want to highlight the role that men play, and we'd like to highlight some men who are involved in amazing projects where they're leading from the front. So let's take a look at the programs that are empowering men, the building blocks of healthy relationships, and how men's attitudes are the biggest driver of behavioural change. Please welcome the panel host, Pam Baker, who's the Chief Executive of the Brisbane Youth Service. She'll be joined by Darcy Robertson from the Safe Relationships Program at BYS, Dean Cooper, who's a violence prevention specialist from Griffith University, Dave Kramer, a behavioural scientist and ambassador for Small Steps for Hannah, and Professor Michael Flood, a researcher at QUT's Centre for Justice. Thanks very much. Over to you, Pam.
Thank you so much. Welcome, everybody. What an exciting panel to host. It's a privilege for me to be interviewing these amazing humans that are advocating for change in a very tough what could you call it, environment. So meet the men making women's safety their issue. We've got 4 humans sitting in front of me. We have Michael Flood, we've got Dean Cooper, Dave Kramer and Darcy Robertson. And I've got some big questions to ask the 4 of you. Are we ready? Sure. These are great humans. I got to spend a little bit of time with them preparing for this session, and all of them have a heart of gold and truly believe that they can make a meaningful difference to men and boys and young men across Australia and in Queensland. It's a huge topic, so we'll get straight into the questions. So let's unpack men's and male behavioural change programs. I might throw first to Dave. Actually, I might throw to you all. I'll ask you all this question, I think. How do these programs work? Dave, I'll start with yourself.
I have not been part of men's behavioural change programs, so it's not my area of expertise. I think Dean knows a lot more about it.
Dean and Darcy.
Yeah, Dean.
But you've seen them from the sidelines. Have you seen?
My experience with men's behavioural change programs has been largely second-hand from Dean's experience. So,
okay. Well, we'll go across to yourself.
You're too humble, Dave.
Yeah.
Humble. Men's behavioural change programs, there's quite a few around. The prominent one used in Australia is based on the Duluth curriculum from Duluth in Minnesota. To really give you an insight into what that looks like is it's essentially what we aim to achieve in there is a cognitive restructure behind the thinking that drives behaviour. So, feminist Eva Cox has a great quote that it's not how do we stop men from doing this to us, but how do we stop them from feeling entitled to do it. So we look for the driving belief system underneath that allows men to behave like this. And the flag that we look for and what we should all look for in our friends, in our community, in our work colleagues is the she should. If we hear a she should, there's usually a belief system behind that or an expectation or an entitlement to certain behaviour. So the programs aim to unearth those and talk about them in a way that's not shaming, embarrassing, or belittling, because what neuroscience and offender rehabilitation has taught us is that a shamed brain never learns. So it's about having conversations about whether those belief systems serve them in their relationship, allow them to be the father that they want to be, allow them to be the partner that they'd like to be, because none of them want to be in prison with domestic violence orders, with their partners and children hiding from them. None of them want to be there. So how did we get here? And that's the process of the Men's Behavioural Change Program, is that it is a process of change that starts in that room with those conversations about those belief systems that drive behaviour.
What's the average age of the male-identified person that engages in these programs that you run?
In my personal experience, it's been vast, from 18 years old to 60. And no particular across Gold Coast and Brisbane, and I've even done some stints in Mount Isa and Mornington Island. And the age, there is no really specific age I could tell you, other than the fact that they're all, the only thing they have in common is that they're raised in the same culture about what they believe is their role in relationships, or their role as a man, of how to act, how to be, how to father, what others expect of them, is the same thing that they have all consistent. I've had doctors, I've had pilots, I've had unemployed, I've had police officers in programs, a broad spectrum of people, and the one thing they have in common is that belief system that drives behaviour.
And Darcy, you're one of the coordinators for our Safe Relationships program that runs a slightly different kind of men's behavioural change program. Can you talk to that for us?
Yeah, so is that on? Working? Cool. So the KIND program that we do at BYS, we work with young people specifically in a one-on-one context. So roughly 15 to 25-year-olds. And our program is basically designed at, I guess, being one-on-one and really trauma-informed, designed at creating a really comfortable, safe therapeutic space for young people to be able to start to build awareness of and take accountability for their use of violence while developing skills to really address that use of violence and change it and create safety in their relationships. So I think it's often a slow process, and we're lucky that we're a really tailored program and we can kind of work with the individual where they're at, and giving them a really kind of, I guess, flexible approach to completely take that time to challenge their beliefs in a space where we know they're going to be comfortable and they're going to remain engaged. Being a voluntary program as well, we know that if we force engagement or if we try to force challenging their beliefs too quickly, we can often lose sight of them altogether and they just don't return. And then we don't have eyes on the relationship, we don't have eyes on them and their partners. So I think our biggest thing is just really taking that time while promoting as our main sort of priority safety of women. And that's often for us a lot of use of dynamic safety planning. So although it can take a long time for our young people to be developing their skills and taking accountability and working on changing their beliefs and attitudes, I think safety has to be at the forefront of our work, and they can start to we work with them to develop that skill of creating their own safety plans and working with us as they do it. So once they start to develop more skills, we actually see them implementing those into their safety plans as we're changing them dynamically, and we can really see that change happening with safety at the forefront.
And Michael, as an academic in this area, what do you see across the landscape with men's behavioural change programs? How do they work?
Look, just to be cheeky, I'm not going to comment as either an academic or on men's behavioural change programs. Look, I was just thinking about this forum, about a women and homelessness forum, and we know that domestic violence drives that. And the passion for me as an academic and as an advocate as well is what positive roles men can play in preventing and reducing domestic violence and the gender inequalities that are at the heart of domestic violence. And I was thinking, yes, men's behaviour change work is a critical part of that work, and it's good to hear a bit about that. And I was thinking, what about men who don't do that? And I was thinking there's three things that men in general can do to lessen the problems of homelessness and the domestic violence that feed homelessness. One is that we not personally drive women into homelessness. That is, that we treat the women and girls in our own lives with respect and care, such that our behaviour doesn't feed into separation, doesn't feed into divorce, doesn't feed into the forms of domestic and sexual violence that set women and children and others up for homelessness. So the first thing I think for men to do is literally to put our own houses in order to make it less likely that we will, strip others of their housing. Second thing that men can do is speak up. And I think so often men find ourselves in situations where another man is behaving in a coercive or abusive or sleazy or derogatory way towards women, and many of us don't do anything about that. We don't think the behaviour is okay, but we don't know what to do, we don't know what to say, or we don't want to be the party pooper and so on. But a second thing men can do is speak up. Speak up in relation to the men around us who are behaving or commenting in ways that, again, feed into domestic and sexual violence and thus into homelessness. The third thing that men in general can do is join the campaigns and services represented by the people in this room, join the collective movements to end domestic and sexual violence, vote for candidates who give a shit about women and domestic violence, put our money and our time and our energies into political groups, into efforts that will make the structural and systemic change that we actually need. So I'm really sorry I didn't answer your question at all, but anyway, yeah.
That's fine. I think Darcy and Dean have set a great landscape there, that we know that there's men's behavioural change programs aimed at adults, and that there is innovative models like KIND that are focused on that early intervention and changing behaviour early, which hopefully decreases the flow of men coming in to the adult behavioural change programs is our goal and our desire. So we know that they exist and they're a vital part of the system, and we know through many of the inquiries that have happened that there is a big ask for an investment in behavioural change programs. We know that behavioural change programs alone are not the answer. And, Michael, you just touched on it before. There's a culture here. There's a whole of community and society response required. So, Dave, I will throw to you now because you might feel a bit more comfortable answering this question. So how does holding men accountable look like? If we're to change culture and we're to stop this from happening, what does that look like in your opinion?
Yeah, so I guess that's, for me, it comes down to that second point you just made there, Michael, with speak up and what might prevent us from speaking up. For those who don't know, I was very close with Hannah Clark. This gets hard. I was also friends with Rowan Baxter at one point, or for a number of years, for about 8 years. And that speak up thing I felt a lot throughout the period of the relationship I had with Baxter. But what stopped me was that what he was doing was what everyone else was doing. It was something that I'd grown up with, something that I'd seen all the boys. I played rugby league, I hung out in male groups, I worked in factories when I was younger. It was all pretty much the things he said, the things he did, the way he behaved was what everyone else was doing. And so one of the barriers for me was that, where's the problem, right? Until the 19th of February, I didn't realise that there was such a problem with these kinds of behaviours, and even myself. In the last few years of work that I've been doing since Han passed in investigating what went on, how it happened, how it occurred and why it happened, I myself have recognised all the things that I did to contribute to supporting the belief systems that he held that gave him the entitlement to do what he did. So one of the challenges we have in speaking up, I think, is that we see ourselves as that person who's contributing to that culture, and then that resistance, that cognitive dissonance, I guess, we create around that. Well, I'm not part of the problem. I'm not contributing to the problem. It's not my fault. Gets in our way of actually saying to our mate, you can do better. I sit back over the last 2.5 years thinking about all the things that I would have, could have and should have done to prevent Baxter from doing what he did. And when I do that, I also think about all the things I did to give him permission to do it. All the jokes that Michael spoke about that I told with him and laughed at with him, the sexist jokes that I contributed to, the sitting alongside him as he yelled at Hannah for not playing her role as a mother with the kids, not doing what mothers should do, and not saying anything although I felt uncomfortable. Like, all of those moments were periods, were points where he got permission from me to take the steps that he took. And I think for some men, it's we look at the problem, the big problem that we see with domestic violence and men's violence against women, and then we think about the fact that maybe I've contributed to this culture, and then we create this distance between us and the culture that contributes to violence against women and say, no, there's nothing wrong with it, it's just a joke. It is just a joke, when really it's not. Right? And I think some men find it very difficult to see that it isn't just a joke, they're not just words. It's not just rating someone out of 10 just because that's your opinion. It's really devaluing and dehumanizing women in such a way that it gives people permission to use violence against them. So if we go back to point 2 that Michael said, speak up, we have to, I guess, first take accountability for any contributions that we might have made in ourselves to that culture that supports violence against women, which isn't easy, but it's necessary if we're going to change the culture. I don't know if that answers the questions.
No, you did very well. I guess let's unpack this a little bit further, and I might throw to Darcy. Are young people born to be people that use violence? I know we've talked a little bit about culture that feeds it, that affirms it, that says it's okay, and some of it is stuff that we don't realise we do every day. Some of it is boys will be boys behaviour that gets brushed off as that. Darcy, do the young people use support? Are they born to use violence? What are the conversations you have with these young men that give you insight into this?
Yeah, I think off the back of Dave and Michael there, I think we have a really important role in working with young people when they are at those early stages, because I don't think they start at a point on this far end of the spectrum. And thinking actually about a presentation I saw Dean give recently, he's used a sort of bus analogy where if at one end of the bus line is pretty severe violence against women and the start of the bus is, you know, something seemingly quite minor, like making jokes and that sort of thing, you know, you don't get to the end of the bus line without going through all of these steps beforehand. So I think when working with young people, we're at a really pivotal stage in their development to interject when they're, say, maybe they've just gotten on the bus and they're not getting all the way along there yet. Can you, repeat what you...
Yeah,
I've lost my train of thought here thinking about a bus.
That's okay. It's so nerve-wracking sitting up here. So it's easy to forget a question. So when you work with young people, you're working at really the beginning of violence being used into partner relationships, and obviously some violence has started in the home that young person is using violence. Are young people born as users of violence, or is there more behind that? What do young people tell you? Why did they start using violence, and how did their journey start in it being affirmed that it might be okay or a useful tool in responding to particular situations?
Yeah, so I think in terms of, you know, larger societal pressures, but then a majority of our cohort have their own experiences of family violence in the home, and you know, many that we speak to have their own traumas and attachment traumas and learned behaviours of what they've seen has worked and what's worked for their family and what's been done to them and what people have used in order to kind of maintain power in their relationships. And I think what we often see with our young people is sometimes maybe a minimisation or a reinforcement of the use of that behaviour, because something that they've seen in their childhood is up here, and what they're doing right now might seemingly be kind of minor for them in comparison to that. And they go, well, I'm not up here, I'm not at this level, but right now I might be using that. And then those things work for them and it gets reinforced. And I think they continue to use them. And then, you know, unless someone's stepping in to tell them, hey, this isn't okay, I know this has worked before and you've seen this work before and it's working for you now, just pushing that safety and, you know, interjecting as early as we can.
Yeah, great. So, Dean, you're working a little bit, I know you said that you do see some 18-year-old human beings, but you're working along the age continuum. What are the perspectives of some of the men that you've worked with in relation to this? Why have they gotten this far down the track and they're still behaving in this way or have started behaving in this way?
I think it really touches on what Michael was saying, that I think to be realistic about men's behavioural change programs, that I get a man, you know, fresh from release from custody for an hour and a half once a week for 27 weeks. We need the community around and the other men around, particularly, that wherever that person goes in our community, they get the same message of accountability, and the survivor in that relationship gets a message of support. And that's really important to wrap that around. What I'm seeing from men on the age continuum is that, surprisingly and alarmingly, men who perpetrate really significant violence feel like the victims, which is really fascinating to think that they could do things so horribly and then present themselves as victims. And what, through men's behaviour change work and thousands of hours of conversations with men in prisons and rooms and having conversations about use of violence, I found was they're not actually a victim of her violence. They're a victim of what they feel entitled to. And so when that isn't given, offending from a victim perspective is really powerful. You don't have to look far for national world examples of uprisings and what it looks like when people feel victimised and how they respond, which is how when someone... I always use the example, and it's a really crazy example to use in a domestic violence setting, but I always think if you've ever had lived in an apartment complex and you have your reserved park, and then you get home from a long day of work and you get there and someone's parked in your spot, it's like the injustice of that and you want action immediately, you want them to, and that's what these men move into, is the injustice of her autonomy, the injustice of her decision making without consulting me. And to give you really wild example to draw to the parking is that they fall into that mindset of I'm a victim here and I need to reassert some control and some order in my home. And they do that through really violent means and some coercive, more common coercive means, which has really been brought to the surface lately in conversations about coercive control. So it can be really subtly or really overtly. And those subtle forms are reinforced in communities around through jokes and languages. And I realised that when I went into a men's behavioural change program for the first night, and jokes that I had participated in and chants that I had led in a rugby environment were being told in the room. And that was my full journey perspective, as Darcy was touching on, that continuum that, not everyone that's ever laughed at an inappropriate joke at a pub or a rugby club is going to go home and perpetrate domestic violence, but everyone that has perpetrated violence has stopped at each stop along the way. And that's the role of the community, and what Michael was saying in point 2 of speaking up is it's actually easier to intervene when we hear a problematic joke or a sexist remark. It's really hard to intervene when someone's being violent. So we tell ourselves that these little jokes and these behaviours that we see are the hard things to intervene in, but they're really, in the scheme of what domestic and family violence is actually the easier time to hold someone gently and respectfully accountable.
Yeah, great. Michael, what are your thoughts on it?
I just wanted to come back to your earlier question to Darcy. I think there's a really clear sense in which perpetrators are made, not born. That, we can trace the kind of social and cultural and community conditions that make it more likely that individuals, particularly men, sometimes women, but particularly men, will use domestic and sexual violence. We can trace the conditions in their families, in their communities, in their peer groups, in their sporting cultures, in their university residences, in their workplaces, and so on. So there's all kinds of ways in which perpetrators are made by social and cultural conditions. So to prevent that domestic and sexual violence, we're going to have to change those social and cultural conditions. And men's behaviour change programs are critical work, and they only see maybe 1% of the people who are using domestic and sexual violence in Australia. And we need other strategies to complement those to make it less likely that people will be turned into perpetrators in the first place. And people on the panel have talked about the norms of entitlement, the norms of sexism and so on that feed into some men's violence. I feel a little bit of hope that we're starting to see a growing community conversation about those norms and the need to change them. Quick poll, hands up, who's seen the Barbie movie? Okay, I'm seeing it on the weekend with my daughter, but I've read all the spoilers because I've been reading about it. I think the Barbie movie is really interesting because it's a little bit about patriarchy and how patriarchy involves costs for men in some ways, as well as giving men a whole series of unfair privileges. And it's one little thing that's sort of starting conversations, among other things, about how, in fact, it will be in men's broader anti-patriarchal interest to move away from the models of masculinity that feed into violence, that feed into sexism and so on. I wanted to sneak in Barbie somehow.
No. I haven't seen it yet, but if it is going against that, I'd be up for seeing it. I was protesting. That's a really good point that you've touched on there. And I know we're sort of sat in sort of the gloom, but we do want to come out the other end and talk about hope because we know, well, I've seen it in particular with our KIND program, there is hope. And once men realise the systems that they're a part of, the trauma that they've experienced and the behaviours they've used to adapt are not ones that are fruitful, change can occur. But before we go there, I just want to ask one last question, and I'll throw open to the four of you. When have we seen men's behaviour change programs not work? When doesn't it work? I might go to Darcy and yourself. Which one of you wants to answer it first? Darcy, you want to give it a go? Being in the youth perspective?
Yeah. I think, as I said, from my experience, as I've said, it's running a voluntary program. It's really important that we provide our young people with a supportive environment that's going to make them want to come back, and really helping to instill that hope in them that they can change and that they can make progress. I think times where we've seen it not work is when we give our young people sort of strict expectations to adhere to our program and to go home and to implement that into their lives without providing them with wraparound support. Yeah. We're quite lucky at Brisbane Youth Service. I think with a lot of our young people, they've come to us with case managers and other support workers, but not everybody has that. And I think if they're coming in to do the work and then expected to go back and kind of do a 9-week program or however long and then go back and just sort of implement that and everything be okay, I think it's not going to work, and they really need that extra follow-up support and that ongoing support and just wrap around everything to sort of keep it happening and keep working on it as they go.
Why shouldn't we just send all young people to adult men's behavioural change programs?
I think, what we've seen with our young people is that they don't often feel safe in those spaces. And as I said before, a lot of them are coming from their own experiences of family violence. And I think they can definitely struggle to be in those environments with, there might be a bit more of a strict focus on accountability without really taking the time to acknowledge their experiences and be able to work through those. So I think we often see that young people really, really benefit from having a safe therapeutic space where they can build a relationship with a client and do that relational work, and take the time to work through those underlying things that are contributing to their violence.
Yeah, great. Dean?
Yeah, I think a big misconception that we have is that anger management is a solution. But what we find is that anger is really confined to one person, and that is the partner in the home and that home environment. The other thing with anger management that doesn't work is that it's essentially collusion, in that you're saying that she is a problem that makes you angry, and therefore there's that collusion that starts to occur between a therapist and a perpetrator, a client. As well as skills-based application learning, such as mindfulness and just walk away and things like these. They're not tools on the belt that someone will reach to if they don't have the belief system to support it. It's like trying to teach a far right-wing racist about a immigration policy that is going to be beneficial for everybody. They don't have the belief system or the drive to want to reach to that, to be able to implement it. So that's why skills-based application doesn't learning, and where men's programs and where wider community can hold people accountable is to say, why are the only two tools on your belt as a father and as a partner in the home to be violent or to walk away? Why can't we reach to other tools? And I think that really feeds into a lot of what Michael was saying about masculinity and and belief systems and expected behaviours to conform to those rigid forms of masculinity that men are severed off from reaching to those tools of nurturing, acceptance, compromise. And then we see that feed into why skills-based application learning doesn't work in this space.
Great intel. So let's go on to hope, okay? So where do we see these programs work? What magic happens? Dave, can I throw to you? Where have you seen the magic happen where someone's come out the other side? Tell us a little bit about that.
Coming out the other side is probably not somewhere where I've got to just yet, but where I've seen some magic happen is I do some work with schools on behalf of Small Steps for Hannah, and being parts of panels and holding conversations with young people. And just last week I was on a panel at a high school, and I'd spoke about some of the things that I'd experienced as a young person in terms of my jealousy and how I used my jealousy to justify controlling behaviours, telling my girlfriend who she should and shouldn't follow on Instagram, and how I wished that my mates at the time had said to me, mate, let's work through what you're going through and not worry about what she's doing for now. Let's deal with what you have going on for you, rather than saying, yeah, she shouldn't be doing that. Yeah, you should be telling her not what to do. That's what my mates were actually telling me at the time. And after the conversation, I told a little bit about that story and how I wished they'd responded differently, and I wished I'd responded differently, and the things I could do now. There were 5 young men who came up to me afterwards and asked if they could have a longer chat about that particular thing. And what they were talking about was that they, as Dean mentioned, felt the right to tell her, like, she shouldn't be following that guy though, if he was her ex-boyfriend or something like that. She shouldn't be following him. Aren't you entitled to say no, like that she can't? Aren't you entitled to set boundaries? And so we had a discussion around boundaries and around what's good for me and what's good for her at the same time, and how we, it was a very brief discussion, but how do we first start to understand that our behaviour, our experience of jealousy isn't permission to then manipulate and control someone else's behaviour. We need to really address and be able to respond to our jealousy in a way that supports our health and well-being along with the health and well-being of other people. And after we had that conversation, a couple of the teachers had come up to me and said, you know what, that's the first time those 5 young men, we've had significant challenges with them since about grade 10. This is a year 12 cohort with them and girls in the school. That is the first time they've ever had a conversation about their own accountability. So if we can hold the space, like Darcy was talking about, in a way that helps them to understand that, we're facing challenges, and young people, they're facing significant challenges these days that even as a 36-year-old, I don't understand when it comes to social media and pornography and all those different influences that they're consuming all the time. They're facing real challenges. So when we sit in a space that gives them the opportunity to understand those challenges from their perspective, and I heard Kathy earlier talk to them from their perspective, get an understanding of them. Jan said something about working with young people and bringing them into the development and the creation of the programs that we do. I think that's where the hope is, where we understand what's actually going on for them and we connect with them in their space, what's happening in their world, and then we share experience that allows them to either take accountability or have some responsibility to responding to those really, really difficult things in ways that support the health and well-being of themselves and others.
That's terrific. So it does start very early in changing people's behaviours and perspectives. Dean, where do you see some of the magic happen?
Yeah, I see change in behavioural change programs, but again, touching off what Michael said, that is the 1% that we see, and I think the real change can come from those preventative conversations when a friend comes to you with expressing jealousy or they're angry or whatever it might be, and having those conversations about why is it that you get to be jealous in this instance, like what is it that allows you to be the one that's jealous here, what drives that feeling. I really think from the bystander perspective in the work, really why I've left a lot of the men's behavioural change and my career in corrections to work in the bystander space is that it's going to take a community to hold everybody gently and respectfully accountable for that behaviour. We can do that in a lot of different ways, and I think Dave touched on there about seeing it from someone's perspective, and I think a lot of the time we need to seek to understand, not to be understood with this behaviour, and understand, tell me more about that. We need to take a line of inquiry into the behaviour to say, we need to get curious about why this is happening and why they feel a certain way. And we can do that by putting question marks on the end of statements sometimes, just saying, like, I'm not sure that sounds safe. Like, I don't know. Like, what about, to me that sounds a little bit unkind. What do you think? And we can ask these questions. And for me, as a person who's usually the only person in the TAB section of a pub advocating against domestic and family violence, the thing that I reach to all the time is an I feel statement as a bystander is one of our biggest tools that we can reach to say, what I'm hearing makes me feel really uncomfortable. Doesn't become about the person who said it, it's about the behaviour, and we attach a feeling to it, which makes it really hard for them to say, no, you're really comfortable with what I'm saying. So an I feel statement can say, we're all dads now. Do we agree? Can we just agree we just don't talk like this anymore? And we can start to set those protocols that we do, and we set with our children so well, like you take your shoes off before you come into this house. You don't use language like that when you come into this house. And we need to start doing it within our friendship circles to say, I know we may have told jokes like that before, but can we agree moving forward we don't do that anymore? And so we can really start to gently and respectfully hold people accountable for certain behaviours that they don't realise. And when they realise the power of language and what they're saying and what they're contributing to, when you realise the power of language, you don't just say anything anymore. And I think that's really the key hope in that is the community of bystanders to do that and men doing the work and speaking out.
That's great. Now, I wanted to keep going down the panel, but believe it or not, we're almost at time. But there's still opportunity to say something, because I can't leave this opportunity to allow each and every one of you the opportunity to ask a question, because I know some of you are wriggling in your chairs and very excited to have this conversation and ask some good questions. So do you want to raise your hand for me if you would like to ask the panel a question? I'll pause here. Come on, don't be shy. We're all friends. You're amongst friends.
I'm always that person who never asks a question, and I always...
Terrific.
My heart palpitates at the thought of it. Anyway, here I go. So a belief is a thought hooked into a feeling, and I read that and I wept. And from all my research and everything I felt today, and I don't want to cry, but I'm going to, because everything that's been said today, I feel like I've either lived it, felt it, or researched and understood it. And it all comes back to love. I can't help it, but when we sit with our feelings and listen so deeply, it's always love. And I just wanted to bring that to light today, because men and women are meant to be together in harmony and in peace and to love one another. And when we're that disconnected, because our government's that disconnected from our communities and individuals don't understand the rules which govern us, there's no doubt about it, we forget how to care. And so there's no real question, but I just wanted to comment and say how often do you speak about love when you're talking to these beautiful young men who we have to love no matter how terrible they can be sometimes? I don't look at things as being victim or perpetrator. I just see a terrible identity crisis caused from society. And it breaks my heart. And I've had to sit in some very deep feelings. And I couldn't speak because I felt too judged in my whole life, always judged. And being around lots of abuse and violence, and being in all different areas of society, public, private, tertiary, I seem to have been put in all these different pockets to really understand the mechanisms of how we're raising our children. And it does break my heart. So I just wanted you to talk a bit more about love. Thank you.
Thank you. We might throw to Darcy. Do you want to talk a little bit about how often we talk about love with our young people?
I think I'll just say from my perspective in working with young people, the power of the relationship between us and them, ourselves and the young person that we're working with. And there's a quote from a famous psychotherapist I really like, Irvin Yalom, that's it's the relationship that heals. And I think coming from a really strong background, and I just love relational practice, and a lot of the young people we're working with have never really even just had the chance to sit with somebody and be vulnerable and explore these concepts and just explore their feelings and what it's like to love somebody and what that feels like. So to be able to sit with them and talk about that and even build a relationship between yourself and them that they might have never had before, I think is really powerful. And it really does have an impact. That is coming from the perspective of working with that 1%. So it's, on that pretty small scale, but I think it can be really powerful in those relationships to build that.
Awesome. And then we got a question at the back there. Yep.
I was just wondering what's happening with preventatives for young children, because I've personally experienced that schools still don't, it's still like boys will be boys, and even though there was a $1 billion program of stopping it at the start, and I've often said to schools, why don't you go back and sort of watch that again? Surely those billions of dollars that went into that campaign should be rerun.
Yeah, I completely agree. It needs to be done earlier, and I don't think the words of men's behavioural change program I really don't like. It sounds scary in a place that people don't want to walk into. It sounds like a birthday invitation where it looks like the party sucks and you don't want to go there. So I really think we have to look at the invitation we give young people to step into those programs and to commit to that. And I really think that's really where it starts, and it's something Dave and I are really passionate about or working on, that as Michael said, 1% of people maybe access a men's behavioural change program, but we shouldn't have to wait till a young person develops into someone who's using violence or is gone to prison and has a domestic violence order to access the education and the support they need. So Dave and I are kind of really passionate about that space, and starting earlier and having some of these more what we would consider adult conversations in these behavioural change programs, but they come back to love and connection and safety, and these are real conversations that should be happening at that young level. So I completely agree. Preventative, definitely.
I was just going to ask on that, and we'll take one more question and we'll bring it to a close. Is it just boys at early school that should be educated, or is it all young people educated if we're going to end the cycle of violence?
Yeah, I think all young people need the education, but I think we also need to focus, if we're going into schools and supporting young people to understand the challenges that they might face and the kinds of things they can do to contribute to healthy and respectful relationships, we also need the school system to support those behaviours. We need to look at the leadership level of the school, and if it's all men, is that really supporting gender equality in the school, right? We need to address every single aspect of what's going on in that community, and I've heard Michael speak about this a bit with a young man who might go to a respectful relationships program and spend a couple of hours a week doing that, but then he goes and plays footy with it and trains 3 nights a week in a footy team where the coach is very ingrained in that masculine culture, and the team is involved in that, and then they go and hang out with their friends on the weekend and do the same things. How much impact is that 1 hour a week or 2 hours a week going to have over the course of 4 to 6 weeks? So it needs to be a systemic school systems change. I think Michael speaks to that quite well as well.
And I'll just ask Michael, your very last comment to close. What's your thoughts on healthy masculinity?
Look, I'm really pleased that it's on the agenda, that the growing number of community organisations and others are talking about healthy masculinities or positive masculinities, and having done research on programs that self-consciously are aimed at boys and men and trying to foster some notion of healthy masculinities, most of them are feminist informed, most of them are working with or are developed by women's rights organisations. Not all, though, and there is some unevenness, and there's tokenism and cynicism and commercialism as well. So it's not all wonderful. But I'm really pleased to see that the notion that men and boys have a positive role to play in ending violence against women and in building gender equality is increasingly on the agenda, and that in general, that's my caveat, but that in general, that is productive work.
I invite you to give these amazing humans a round of applause. Thank you.